steps are you taking to make sure that your ICE agents are not masked and properly identified when they approach someone?
Well, ICE agents always identify themselves to individuals that they're encountering or that they're working with. What I would say as far as if they are wearing something over their faces, it's oftentimes because that agent has been involved in undercover operations.
Your materials, ICE agents, jackets and the sorts, are available on Etsy for 20 bucks. Anybody can do that, throw a mask on, and run around and terrorizing people of color without any regard for the law.
Our agents do identify themselves. They verbally do that, and then also by the clothing that they're wearing. And if they do have something that is covering some of their facial features, it's for their investigative work or their undercover work that they do as a part of their job duties as well.
Congresswoman Julie Johnson have a tense exchange with Secretary Kristi Noem. It was a moment that laid bare the clash between compassion and carelessness in how America enforces its immigration and law enforcement policies. Julie Johnson wasn't merely criticizing, she was defending the dignity and safety of ordinary people, especially immigrants and communities of color, who are too often treated as targets instead of human beings.
I want to address several issues. I'm going to try not to repeat a lot of issues that have been addressed, but I do have some substantial concerns over how ICE agents present themselves to the public. Oftentimes, we've seen many videos out there where they're masked and not properly identified. I have a lot of real personal concern about that. I just put myself in the situation of that woman from Tufts, for example. You're just walking down the street, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, 3 masked men, not properly identified, attack you and try to take you away. I find that to be reprehensible and not the values of this country. What steps are you taking to make sure that your ICE agents are not masked and properly identified when they approach someone?
Well, ICE agents always identify themselves to individuals that they're encountering or that they're working with. What I would say as far as if they are wearing something over their faces, it's oftentimes because that agent has been involved in undercover operations or needs to be able to continue the investigative work that they do on a day-to-day basis.
But don't you think, Madam Secretary, that people have a right to see whoever's trying to apprehend them? I think it's creating this unrealistic vigilante system. And are you aware that your materials, ICE agents, jackets and the sorts, are available on Etsy for 20 bucks? Anybody can do that, throw a mask on, and run around and terrorizing people of color without any regard for the law, without any regard, because your agency does not have proper protocols to make sure their agents are clearly identified and marked when they're executing their jobs.
Our agents do identify themselves. They verbally do that, and then also by the clothing that they're wearing. And if they do have something that is covering some of their facial features, it's for their investigative work or their undercover work that they do as a part of their job duties as well. What I would say is that it is important that we follow the procedures and protocols for every encounter that we have, and they have done that in every situation to the best of my knowledge.
Well, I would suggest that your protocols need to be revised, because I don't think it's reasonable for masked men to be apprehending people on the streets. I think that instills a lot of fear. It doesn't instill security in the process. And in states like Texas, that is open carry, when any jackadoo can be walking around with a gun. I think some tragic circumstances are at bay. I'd like to switch gears to due process. I have a lot of concerns about the lack of due process that your agency has been affording people in this country. In Texas, for example, you had rounded up 171 individuals, were preparing to deport them, and it wasn't until the Supreme Court issued an opinion that that was unconstitutional and that their due process rights were being violated did your agency actually stop and adhere to the Supreme Court's opinion. My question to you is, has those efforts ceased in your agency? Are you going to cease trying to deport people without access to due process in the courts of law and compliance with the United States Supreme Court?
Well, Congresswoman, we are following due process and using it as to how Congress has laid out to us in statute, and we are complying with all federal judges' orders as well.
You weren't complying at that time. It took the United States Supreme Court to order you to comply, so you hadn't proactively complied on your own. You were intending to wrongfully deport people without access to a court hearing, without access to the rule of law, and that is why it was necessary for the United States Supreme Court,
due process does not guarantee a hearing,
who issued an opinion ordering you and your agency to comply with the due process rights of the people in this country. That's what separates, that's what makes our country great, is we do have access to due process. And so my comment to you is I'm hoping as you move forward, because initially as you were proceeding through these deportation processes, you were not affording people due process, and the Supreme Court has now ordered you to do so. So I am assuming by your testimony that you do intend to comply with the Supreme Court's order moving forward, and we're not going to have any more instances of wrongful deportation without proper access to due process. Is that correct?
We are following federal judges' orders, and we are complying with due process
Well, we look
procedures
forward to
as
that.
they are laid out, as Congress has given us those tools to do that.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I have one other question about FEMA. I'm very concerned about the destruction of FEMA. You know, Texas is a state that has a lot of hurricanes, tornadoes, and natural disasters. We rely upon FEMA extensively, and I'm very worried about that. And when you are governor, though, you actually utilize FEMA for your own state. So you did recognize at the time when you were serving as a governor that FEMA played an important role in natural disasters within South Dakota. Is that correct?
Yes, we had 12 FEMA-related disasters during the 6 years I served as governor of the state of South Dakota.
But I just find it, I'm running out of time, but I just find it ironic.
Her questioning cut right to the heart of a serious issue: accountability in federal enforcement. Johnson raised a concern most Americans probably haven't thought deeply about: the fact that anyone can buy ICE-branded gear online, from jackets to patches, for just a few dollars. That means any person, any vigilante, can throw on an ICE jacket, cover their face, and start intimidating people. Imagine the fear that creates in immigrant neighborhoods, especially in open-carry states like Texas. When law enforcement symbols are so easily abused, people lose the ability to tell the difference between an actual officer and someone looking to terrorize them. Johnson wasn't just talking about merchandise, she was talking about a culture of fear. She painted a vivid picture: a woman walking down the street, suddenly surrounded by masked men claiming to be ICE. No identification, no visible credentials, just aggression and intimidation. For most Americans, that scenario sounds unthinkable, but for many immigrant families, it's a daily fear. And her point was simple: that's not who we are as a nation. Kristi Noem's defense that masks might be used for undercover work or investigative purposes missed the moral and emotional point. Johnson wasn't questioning the need for legitimate undercover operations. She was questioning why the system allows such a loose standard for identification, one that opens the door for abuse and fear-mongering. In a democracy, law enforcement should protect, not terrify. It should be transparent, not faceless. Johnson also shifted to a foundational issue: due process. She highlighted how ICE had been rounding up and preparing to deport hundreds of people without proper legal hearings, until the Supreme Court itself had to intervene and declare those actions unconstitutional. That's a stunning admission of how far some in government have drifted from the rule of law. Think about that. It took the highest court in the land to remind a federal agency that people, regardless of where they were born, still have the right to due process. That's not just a legal oversight, it's a moral one. When Johnson pressed Noem, she wasn't simply talking about immigrants. She was defending the principle that every person deserves their day in court. That principle is at the very core of American democracy. It's what separates our system from regimes that rely on fear, force, and arbitrary power. Johnson made it clear that this isn't a partisan issue, it's an American one. Then came another critical point: FEMA. Johnson reminded Noem of her own record as governor, when she relied on FEMA aid multiple times during disasters in South Dakota. Johnson's tone wasn't accusatory, it was ironic. She was pointing out the hypocrisy in criticizing or undermining federal agencies that you've personally depended on when your own citizens were in crisis. FEMA isn't a political tool, it's a lifeline. And Johnson wanted to make sure the American people see that when Democrats defend federal institutions, it's not about bureaucracy, it's about keeping families safe when disasters strike. This entire exchange reflects a deeper divide in American politics today. On one side, you have leaders like Julie Johnson fighting for fairness, empathy, and the constitutional rights of all people. On the other, politicians like Kristi Noem, who often prioritize tough talk over thoughtful policy. The difference is not just ideological. It's about whether power is used responsibly, whether law enforcement respects the people it serves, and whether democracy still means equality under the law. So, when Johnson said masked men shouldn't be able to grab someone off the street without clear identification, she wasn't just making a political point. She was reminding us what democracy looks like when it works. It's transparent, it's just, and it's accountable to the people. And when she brought up due process, she was defending the very soul of the Constitution, the idea that no one, not even the government, is above the law. This was a powerful moment of moral clarity. It showed that real patriotism isn't about posturing or slogans. It's about protecting the principles that make this country worth defending. If you believe that no one should live in fear of being falsely detained, if you believe that justice requires transparency and accountability, then voices like Julie Johnson's need to be heard and supported. Call your representatives. Stay informed about how federal agencies use their power. Demand stronger identification protocols for law enforcement and protections for due process. Because when we hold our institutions accountable, we strengthen them. When we insist on humanity, we make the nation safer for everyone. This is how democracy defends itself, not through fear, but through fairness, not through secrecy, but through sunlight. And that's exactly what Julie Johnson brought into that hearing room, a little bit of sunlight in a place that desperately needed it.